In this video, we're going to examine the sources of tax law. Since the world of tax is dynamic and we can't possibly cover everything in the course, it's important to understand the sources of tax law should you be required to investigate a tax matter in the future. As I've said time and time again, taxes are inherently a political matter. As it turns out, this is only partially true. Most experts categorize the sources of tax law into three buckets. Number one, legislative or statutory. Number two, administrative. And number three, judicial. Statutory tax law is the most likely candidate for being politically motivated, as it comes from the construction of statutes or laws. In the U.S., these laws are generally written and certainly enacted by the legislative branch of government. Federally, that's the U.S. Congress. Congress writes the tax law under powers provided by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, and these laws become part of the bigger U.S. federal code. Imagine, if you will, a giant book, and within that book are all the federal laws of the United States. Within a chapter, known as Title 26, are the internal revenue laws of the U.S., which are commonly referred to as the Internal Revenue Code. Within the Internal Revenue Code are unique sections that prescribe tax law. Often overlooked, but clearly part of the statutory framework of tax law, are the numerous tax treaties between the U.S. and other countries. These treaties are intended to mitigate double taxation by both countries and ease the friction of international trade. Congressional lives must be busy because invariably, large parts of the tax law are left ambiguous, either purposefully or through neglect. In these instances, the power to regulate, but not create law, is left to the bevy of regulatory bodies created by the government. In the case of taxes, the U.S. Treasury and one of its primary divisions, the Internal Revenue Service, wield the power of the regulatory pen. The purpose of tax regulations and rulings is not to override existing law, but rather to interpret and provide guidance as needed. As a result, the authority of regulations is not as strong as statute, but deviations from regulatory authority better be well supported if the taxpayer wishes to escape without penalty. As an example, Congress has written laws that provide for certain inflation adjustments each year. For example, the gift tax exclusion we mentioned in a previous video. The computation of the adjustments are performed by the IRS and issued to the tax-paying public each year. In another example, where Congress basically has claimed, ain't nobody got time for that, the statutes covering corporate redemptions of stock use the term essentially equivalent to a dividend. But Congress failed to actually define what that meant. As a result, the Treasury Department and the IRS are left to pick up the baton and piece together a definition so that taxpayers can gain a better understanding of exactly what the phrase means and plan accordingly. Administrative tax law takes the form of regulations, revenue rulings, letter rulings, determination letters, notices, announcements, and a variety of other forms. To make matters worse, the names have changed over time, making it even more difficult to identify the relevant sources. So let's revisit our essentially equivalent to a dividend definition. Because the law is not entirely clear, a taxpayer may claim to have one. The IRS could reasonably look at the exact same transaction and decide that no, it's not essentially equivalent. Finally, after a back and forth that probably ends with, oh yeah, well my dad can beat up your dad, the two parties find themselves in court. In the United States, the court's job with respect to tax issues is to adjudicate the matter and determine which party's definition of essentially equivalent to a dividend is correct. Because in the U.S. courts follow precedent, meaning lower courts and later courts are generally bound to follow that finding, that holding becomes de facto law, making the courts the third of three legs of the tax law. Great! We covered all three sources. And for this class, we really do not need to go any deeper. But know that we have just scratched the surface. In the graduate tax program, for example, we spent half a semester doing nothing but learning and practicing the research of tax law. So there's plenty more to learn, but not for us and not now. This brings us to the end of video T1D on the sources of tax law and concludes the video series based on Chapter 1 of the textbook. Our next video starts Chapter 2 and examines, dare I say it, a good tax. Thanks for watching.